Well, hello and welcome to today's NAGDA Connect webinar, Board and Committee Governance and Best Practices. My name is Gordon Toole. I'm a retirement plan consultant with Innovest Portfolio Solutions, a Colorado-based registered investment advisor. Innovest works mainly with governmental retirement plans, consulting to all facets of plan management, and I am the moderator for today's presentation. Today's session is a panel session where we will discuss board and committee structures and responsibilities. First, a little housekeeping. We are recording this presentation and it will be emailed to you along with a copy of the slides tomorrow. We'll be muted for the duration of the webinar, but please submit questions throughout the presentation in the Q&A box found in the menu at the bottom of your screen. We'll monitor those questions throughout the presentation and either answer those during the presentation or follow up near the end. Your questions will only be visible to the speakers, so please feel free to send those at any time. We also have the chat feature open, which may use to chat with your fellow attendees during the presentation. I want to thank NAGDA's visionary and premier plan sponsors. NAGDA is a mission-driven nonprofit with the goal of being the collective voice of public sector defined contribution plan sponsor industries. We could not meet that mission without the generous support of the companies you see listed here. NAGDA would like to thank you all for being terrific examples of long-term partners. Joining me for the presentation today is Art Carone and Katie Girardi. Welcome and thank you both for being here. And I'll turn it over to Art to introduce himself.
Thank you, Gordon. And thank you for NAGDA for having me here today. And good morning, good afternoon for the attendees. As Gordon mentioned, my name is Art Carone. I'm the Pension and Benefits Administrator for the City of Tucson. I come to the presentation with over 15 years of municipal finance experience, working primarily for two governmental entities here in Tucson, the Town of Oro Valley and the City of Tucson. I do have my MBA as listed here on the slide from the University of Phoenix, and I got my undergrad here in Tucson at the U of A back in 2004. I've been with the city a little over 9 years. It'll actually be 10 years in November. And I've held my current role as Pension and Benefits Administrator since June of 2017. As part of my responsibilities as administrator, I do oversee the city's defined benefit plan, our 3 deferred compensation plans, as well as the city's health and wellness and benefit programs for the city. In my role, I do oversee the 3 boards listed here. So we have the Tucson Supplemental Retirement System Board of Trustees. That's primarily for our defined benefit or our pension plan. And then our Deferred Compensation Management Board, which oversees our deferred compensation plans. We have a 457 and 2 401A plans. And then I also oversee a self-insured health benefits trust board on the benefit side, which we're required to have as a self-insured entity. Getting into the plan a little bit, we do have over 300 million in assets. Innovest is our our investment consultant, and Empower is our record keeper. So do want to thank you again to NAGDA for being here, and thank you for listening, and I'll turn it over to Katie.
Art, and thank you everybody for coming and joining the webinar today, and to NAGDA for allowing me to come and give my wee bit of knowledge behind some of the board practices for today. So I have been now with the Oklahoma Municipal Retirement Funds coming up on 6 years. I am the retirement plan administrator, so it's my duty to travel all around the great state of Oklahoma and sit down with participants and just kind of provide education, get them ready for retirement. I'm also responsible for meeting with city management and presenting to councils. And regarding just plan amendments, I will say that our structure is a little bit different from the majority of the rest of the United States. We actually allow each of our municipalities to customize and tailor their defined benefit plan or defined contribution plan to their employee base and what it is that the municipality can actually afford and what the employees want. So they have the ability to join as a defined benefit plan or a defined contribution plan or both. And every single one of our municipalities is different. So we have altogether about 247, I believe, members across the state of Oklahoma. And that leads to be over 300 plans that are actually going to be different for everything. So again, glad to be here and talk about the board and the best practices that we actually do for the state.
Great, thanks, Katie. I think the timing of this session is really good today. In the current retirement plan industry environment, really committees and boards face a high level of scrutiny regarding their plan decisions. And additionally, I think there are some emerging issues that committee and boards may have not addressed in the past that they're going to need to address going forward. As always, having a prudent process and a proper structure in place are very important for these boards and committees. And committees are always required to make informed and reasoned decisions, which require the right information. It may be difficult sometimes to have that necessary information without really engaging experts. And really to start us off, I think sort of a high level discussion really around structures. And I know from my perspective, I'm probably going to use committees and boards interchangeably today. So for everyone out there, forgive me for that. I know some of you will have committees, some of you will have boards, but as we use that terminology, at least from my perspective, collectively, that's what we're talking about today. I think both for Art and Katie, if you can just discuss really the structure of your committee or board, how many members you have, what they're responsible for, the plans they're responsible for, items like that, really to just get us kicked off and familiar with your structure. And Katie, we can start with you.
Sure, of course. So the Oklahoma Municipal Retirement Fund, we actually have a 9-member board. We have 8 trustees and then 1 at large. So we're split, the entire state is actually split up into districts. So we have a representative from each one of those districts that's actually nominated and then elected into that position. So they do have a 5-year term. And they're more than welcome to do another election, but it is required that they go through the entire process again. So the person that is eligible to actually run for our board seats can be anybody, as long as the one requirement is that the trustee does have to have money in the plan, whether that be a defined contribution plan or a defined benefit plan. They are required to have that money in the plan. The main reason is because we want our trustees to have skin in the game. We need to make sure that if there's decisions that are being made, that they're impacted too, so that they know that they're doing their fiduciary responsibility for all the constituents within the actual plan. The at-large member, that's going to be voted on and going to be for all of the actual districts, and all districts are able to actually vote on who goes into that. Under our board, each of those board members is required to actually participate in a committee. So we have 3 separate committees. We have an administrative committee. They kind of oversee the day-to-day, office, equipment, staff, CEO reviews, budget, those types of things. And then we have a contract committee. So they look at pretty much anything to do with any sort of contracts that's not going to be investment related. So any sort of our custodians, those types, and those are reviewed on an annual basis. And then the last committee that we have is the investment committee, and they are going to be charged with doing our investment policy, working with our investment consultant to do money manager searches, making recommendations. So that is very important to note that none of our committees actually do any sort of action. Everything that they discuss in their meetings can only be just for recommendation to the board. And then at the end of the day, the board is the one who has the overall sight of the actual 2 plans, and they are the ones that make the actual recommendation. And each of those committees, I forgot to mention, are made up of 3 different people. And we really try and make it to where if that committee member or trustee has an interest in, the investment world, or if they're more versed on the administrative side, or if they deal with contracts in their current role, we allow them to actually be elected to that position, but actually show their interest so that they can be elected into that position.
Great, that's a great overview. Art, can you give us an overview of your structures with the various boards that you work with?
Yeah, thanks, Gordon. So I'll focus primarily on the Deferred Compensation Board, Management Board, because I think that's pretty relevant to the conversation today. So the city's Deferred Compensation Management Board is the structure is organized through the city code with a recent change as of this week. The prior membership was, the composition of the membership was 5 members. There was a city manager appointee. There were 2 positions that were elected by the nature of their positions, meaning the HR and the finance director or their delegates become members of that board upon hire. And then we have 2 members that are elected to the board by the participants. Now that's as I mentioned, that's recent. That's going to change as of this week. We're going to move from a 5-member board to a 7-member board with those same 3 appointees, being the city manager appointee, the directors of finance and HR. And now we'll have 2 active members, so members that are active in the plan and still working for the city. And we'll have 2 retired members that still have money in the plan, but have retired from the city. And we really made that change recently as board direction to diversify the board membership and make sure that each class of employees represented as far as actives versus retirees. So that'll be a change that's forthcoming in the coming months. And Mayor and Council just did approve that this week. So as far as roles and responsibilities, the primary role of the Deferred Comp Board is the administration or the oversight of the administration of the plan itself. So reviewing and establishing our investment policy statement, managing our investment lineup, investment performance, so quarterly monitoring of our investment performance, which is obviously done through Innovest. And then we have our record keeper performance, making sure that our record keepers or our record keeper is adhering to the service level agreements in our plan documents, making sure that they're meeting our goals that we've established as far as participant usage, participant deferral amounts, increasing participation, education, understanding the power of the deferred comp program. And then they're also responsible for annual participant fee benchmarking. So we do that on an annual basis to make sure that the fees that our participants are being charged are in line with other jurisdictions that are relevant to our size as far as both from our participant base and plan assets. So that's really the role and the responsibility and the composition of the board. I should mention what they don't do is they don't not responsible for the daily administration. They don't take complaints from members. That's not within their purview. They're not responsible for the daily administration of the plan. That falls to me and my staff. And so we try and keep them at a policy level decision-making board. And we've been successful at that. And I do believe that moving from the 5-member to the 7-member will increase that diversification that they're looking for and making sure that our participants are well represented on the board moving forward.
Great, and I'd say we actually just had a question come in that I think is sort of applicable to this part of the discussion. Question states, what process do you use in selecting the retirees to the board? So maybe if you can both speak to your processes. I know, Katie, you're really sort of a purely elected, so I'm assuming that maybe a retiree might be able to be elected into one of your roles. And in turn, Art, probably more applicable to maybe you, but I'll have both of you touch on that question if you would. And maybe Art, you can just go ahead and continue the discussion. We'll flip over to Katie.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Gordon, was that for me?
Yeah, I think for you.
Okay. So the process that we use or have used in the past is we actually have a roster of our retiree population that we solicit. feedback from, that we send out a solicitation asking for board membership. Now, this was in the past, right, when we had a 5-member board, and that 5-member board, those 2 elected to that those board positions could be active or retired, so it will change moving forward. But we do send out a flyer soliciting soliciting participants for retire the positions. So that's been our primary use, how we engage with our retiree population. On the defined benefit side, rather, we do have a City of Tucson Retirees Association that we capitalize on as well. They have their own membership that we solicit from. And I will say that in the past, participation from this group in the board has been very prevalent. The 2 members that are sitting on the board now are retired members. So they tend to have probably a little bit more of a active engagement in the plan as retired members for very obvious reasons. So that's the process that we've used. And moving forward, I would expect that to continue. Maybe we'll be more specific to the retiree population, as far as you now have 2 dedicated seats on the board, whereas before it was just intermingled with the active population. So that method has proven successful for the city in the past. So I do know there's another question. I did want to mention it. The city's deferred comp board does act as a fiduciary to our participants. And I do think we'll get into the education around the board a little later on. So
We definitely will touch on that education component for boards and committees. And Katie, do you have any thoughts on sort of the retiree component of what you may have in any of your boards?
Yeah, so with our board being a 9-member board, we're almost split half and half. We have 5 active employees with members throughout the entire state, and then we have 4 that are retirees. So we don't necessarily campaign, which we cannot do. I personally cannot campaign, but we don't necessarily campaign for retirees to actually join the board. It all comes down to the city management of our members. So it is actually the responsibility of city council or their board of trustees of that municipality to actually determine who it is that they want to nominate. And that nomination will then go into a ballot election that will be sent to all of the members within that particular district. So if the municipality happens to have a recently retired city manager that knows that, I'm going to say this, they got some time on their hands and can be involved, then they can nominate them, and that's how we would get a retiree on our board. I will say that it's sometimes just a natural transition. We have active members that will be on the board, and then they will move into a retiree status. But again, we don't actively campaign to get retirees, but it can be from either or, active or retired.
Great. I mean, it really sounds like both of you have pretty significant representation of retirees on your boards. And ultimately, I think that's pretty representative of our industry these days, as we've sort of evolved to focus on retirees and pre-retirees as very much being a part of the plan, an important part of what we do and how we manage the plan. And you talked a little bit about diversity and sort of the drive to moving the board from 5 to 7 in your particular case, and for diversification purposes. You might just talk about sort of that process a little bit of how you evolved that board, if the focus really was greater diversification. We know the workforce now has a wide variety of ages and genders and cultures and education levels. So really both of you, I think, can talk about that diversity and maybe both the very positives that we see from a diversified board, varying perspectives, as well as some of the challenges that might present. And Katie, why don't you kick it off on your side? We'll alternate here.
Yeah, sure. So just as far as some of the challenges, as far as, I'm sorry, and Gordon, you cut out a little bit, so can you repeat the question? I'm so sorry, my thing kind of went.
Sorry about that.
Okay.
Hopefully I've got a good connection and you can hear me, but ultimately I think just talking about, both of you have at this point, larger boards as arts is increasing in size. But just the diversification that you have within that board across ages, genders, cultures, education levels. And then in turn, if there are advantages that you see in that diversification or any challenges that the great diversification in a larger board might create.
Gotcha. Thank you. My apologies. I thought you were talking about diversification. I was like, shoot, that just cut out. So as far as diversification on our board, I'll start with positions. The positions within who it is can actually be on the board ranges from top all the way down to bottom. So if we happen to have a member who is a strong mayor form of government, essentially all the way up from the mayor, as long as that he or she is participating in the plan, that somebody is diversified that can be elected to be nominated onto the board, all the way down to somebody that comes and picks up the trash, or is the city clerk or the city treasurer. So all walks of life are always more than welcome. If they're participating in the actual plan, they are able to actually run and be nominated for the board. As far as diversification on gender goes, right now we have three women, and the remainders are actually men. I will say that in the municipal world, with a lot of the positions that are held, there are a lot more, it is dominated more by men. So I think that is one of the reasons right now why we do have a little bit more leaning towards men over women. But like I said, I pros and cons, I think everybody is able to give a pretty unbiased opinion and make sure that their education that they're receiving, it's just all about, doesn't matter if it's a man or a woman, it just pretty much comes down to whether or not they're willing to take on that fiduciary responsibility and get that education and be committed for everything.
Bernard, I know you're really just in the process of evolving this, but do you have any thoughts on sort of diversity on boards and those structures? Moving from a little bit more tightly held board to a bigger board with probably greater diversity as you get a little bit larger.
Yeah, so I can talk a little bit about our current composition. As I mentioned, it's a 5-member board currently, and there's 3 men and 2 women that serve on that board. And the primary driver for wanting to go from 5 to 7 and listening to the board was really to make sure that the representation between active employees and the retiree population was consistent with our current ratio of actives to retirees. And so, that was the main driver. Our defined benefit board is set up as a 7-member board, and they really like that. They like that composition. And so we really just tried to mirror that as far as what we were trying to do on the deferred comp side. So the single biggest challenge that I see with moving to a larger board with defined positions from active and retiree population is making sure that each of the board members understand that they're a fiduciary to the plan itself and not being beholden to their particular group. So a lot of times we want the actives tend to think about only the active employees, or the retirees try to focus on the retiree population solely. There's a constant education and constant reminders that to the board that, you're a fiduciary to all plan participants, not a segment of the participation. And that can be with an all-female board, an all-male board, and across cultures. So I think that's the largest driver. Obviously, more administratively, moving to a larger board means you have to have more members present for a quorum. So that can sometimes drive with schedules and calendar availability. That can drive some administrative challenges on our end as we set the agendas and we set the meetings. So that is a little bit of a background as far as what the city board was thinking about when they wanted to move from 5 to 7, and it was really ensuring that those groups were appropriately represented. And we were able to accomplish that and move to, and I think another positive too is it allows for different mentalities, different philosophies on best ways to engage our participants, best ways to educate, best ways to drive participation. So there's varying viewpoints. And then I think with the active population and those members coming potentially coming from a labor group, such as fire or police or our blue collar labor group, they might have different ways to increase population within their membership. So it brings greater awareness, greater education to what we're trying to do in terms of driving participation and understanding and education around the importance of saving for retirement, utilizing the vehicle, the 457 vehicle to enhance their defined benefit that they would get at retirement. So I think those are all positives with the few challenges that we are going to see and we're going to face moving to that larger board.
Yeah, I truly believe that diversified boards or committees ultimately do get some different perspectives as they look at all the varying demographics that we can look at: ages, cultures, education levels, levels within the organization, items like that. But also have to keep that awareness around board or committee members not thinking of themselves as a representative of a constituency, essentially. We're actually getting a couple items come in through the chat and through the question that we might just want to clarify for the audience here around who is the fiduciary in your particular case. And Art, I think ultimately you're looking at a board and that board being really the fiduciary and no sort of advisory capacity. But you might just talk about it, is the committee or board you're working with purely the fiduciary, or there are any other advisory type committees or subcommittees? I know, Katie, you've got some subcommittees, but really indicated that they weren't decision makers, that ultimately they were advisory and reported up into the board. So we might just clarify for the audience both your structures on that. And Art, you're unmuted, so I'll let you go first.
Yeah, thanks, Gordon. So from my perspective, the 3 boards that I do oversee all serve as fiduciaries to the city, to the plan sponsor. And the primary reason for that, in terms of the way I look at it, is if they have a fiduciary responsibility to the plan participants or the plan sponsor, that being the city in this case, to manage either the investments or the fees that are being charged in the Deferred Compensation Management Board perspective, then they do become a fiduciary to the board. If they're dealing with, if they're making decisions that that will or could have an impact to plan participants or the plan sponsor in their role as board members, that's how we determine, that's how we determine if they're a fiduciary versus advisory. The city of Tucson does have advisory boards that are purely advisory in terms of monitoring spending on our bond proceeds or monitoring the construction of a parks and recreation program from those bond proceeds, which doesn't serve in a fiduciary capacity because you're not serving plan participants or you're just overseeing the dollars that are spent. And so that's how I would differentiate between an advisory board and a fiduciary board with respect to the roles and responsibilities that are outlined in the charter or the ordinance or the authorizing documents that are established with each of the boards. But in my particular case, the 3 that I manage do serve as fiduciaries, and we do make sure that they are acknowledge the fact and are fully aware of that fact as we onboard them as members of each respective board.
Great. Thanks. And Katie, you might just comment briefly on your structure. And I think it is interesting that you've got subcommittees, and maybe we can dive into that topic and sort of the learning that those subcommittees need to have, because they essentially, it sounds like, become a little bit of sort of subject matter experts depending on their subcommittee. But we can touch on that a little bit later as we get into maybe the education component. So you might just really briefly touch on the fiduciary aspect of your structure.
Well, the entire 9-member board is the ones that are responsible for the overall implementation and all fiduciary aspects of either or retirement plan. It doesn't matter if they are actually a member of a defined benefit plan or defined contribution plan. They are responsible as a representative and trustee of that district for both plans. As far as the subcommittees go, we do encourage all of our trustees to actually attend those separate committees so that they can hear if they have any interest or feel that they need to get that in-depth conversation going. Those particular meetings can sometimes last 1 to 2 to, when it's budget time, maybe 3 hours, just depending on what the actual conversation is. But our intended purpose really for those committees is so that that recommendation that is determined and found within those committees is then the next day at our board meeting is then provided to the board. So our board chair will look towards the appointed committee chair and we'll say, what's the recommendation? Is there anything that any of the trustees that were not present at that particular committee meeting very much need to know? And then the board chair, or I'm sorry, the committee chair will then discuss anything that was found, talk about their recommendation. And that really allows us to keep away from those 5+ hour board meetings when we're able to just kind of silo everything. And those trustees that, again, have the interest, and investment wise, we do always try and encourage all of our trustees to actually attend, just because the following day when we do make decisions, whether that be for allocation purposes or in introducing a new asset class or finding a new manager or anything like that, we need to make sure that they're well versed in that. So, but we still just do that as a subcommittee meeting, usually the prior day before the actual board meeting.
Great, thank you. Next topic, I'd sort of like to talk a little bit about probably the balance between really having long-term members that really establish a lot of learning over the cumulative time frame they've been on your board versus maybe the need for a fresh perspective or really invigorated engagement by possibly a new member. Katie, you mentioned you've got 5-year terms and somebody's eligible for a second term if they get elected. So could be a pretty long tenured board in that particular case. And again, that to some extent that can be an advantage just because they learn what they're doing, they learn the plan, they become educated. And Art, I know you've got some very long tenured board members on your board. Maybe both discuss a little bit around sort of what you think around that long-term education and learning the plan, and maybe the balance for sort of a need for a fresh perspective and maybe very invigorated engagement from what might come from a new member. Katie, again, you're not muted, so I'll go to you to start.
Sure. It's funny because when you just mentioned the long-term board members, I think Art and I had the exact same look on our face. We're like, oh yeah, well, there's a couple lifers, needless to say. So yes, that is true. We have a lot of long-term tenure on our board, multiple term limits that they can meet. There is not one. So if somebody retires and is on that board for the next 35 years that they're alive, they can do that. And I will say that, working for OMRF for the past 6 years, I was not as in tune with a lot of the history. And needless to say, the history is what has built this fund and where we're at today. And so from my perspective, I think having those longer term board members has been actually very, very beneficial, because if we look into going into a contract with, X manager or looking into X custodian, they might come up and say, well, we looked at that 15 years ago and this was XYZ. So it's sometimes nice that we don't essentially waste our time by going down one of those avenues, knowing that at the end of the day, it's not even going to be a possibility. But just like with anything in life, getting that this is the way it's always been done, that can sometimes get you into a little bit of trouble. Obviously, we as a board, we appreciate the structure that we have, but I always like to kind of sit in the board meeting, and when you have one of those newer board members, and when I say newer board members, it could be their second term and they're still considered, so they could be almost 6-7 years in and they're still considered a newer board member. So when they kind of poke the bear and ask the questions and the whys and the whats and the hows, I think it provides all of the board members, a little bit of education, and also, like I said, it pokes the bear and makes sure that what we're doing is beneficial to all constituents, all plan members, and kind of keeps us on our toes to make sure that, again, we don't just do it that way because we've always done that way. So I'm pro long-term and I'm pro short-term. New members, I'm good with either, as long as they're being engaging. That's kind of what's most important on our board.
Yeah, Gordon, I think from my perspective, as we have the city on my deferred comp board, we do have one member in particular that I think has been the chairman or on the board since the inception of the plan in the late 70s, early 80s. So we're talking over 30, 40 plus years on the membership, and that does have its benefits, as he can harken back to when we were doing the investments in house, and just the historical knowledge that tenure and only tenure can bring is obviously a benefit to the other board members, as well as anytime you turn over the administrator position, without that historical knowledge on the board, it sometimes may be hard to understand why a decision was made, or how come a certain path was taken versus the other path. But with that being said, the board recently, with the Met Council approval of the codification of the deferred comp program this week, they did implement term limits, whereas they didn't exist before. So they implemented term limits in both of the length of the term and the amount of terms that a board member could serve. And the primary reason for that is, as you indicated, really to get that new membership, that new blood in the plan, to be able to ask those questions, as Katie was mentioning, the reference of poking the bear, asking the questions, making sure that we're not sort of resting on our roles, if so to speak, making sure that there's new eyes, fresh perspectives on the board, things that we may not think about, or ideas that they have to increase participation from their seat, or things of that nature. So the city's deferred comp board is embarking upon new membership, as we just discussed, and now we're going to have term limits. And obviously what that means for me, from an administrator perspective, is there'll be greater education when those new members are onboarded. There'll be greater amount of administrative work with the election process that the term limits bring. Those are all good challenges as I see them. I'm a proponent of changing over the board composition every 4 to 8 years. We have had a challenge in the past engaging with the city of Tucson participant population as far as engagement on the board. And so that is something that will continue to be a challenge, I believe, moving forward. So that's a unique concept, I think, to the city. I don't know if any other folks out there have that same challenge, but we certainly see that on our end. So I think that's sort of my perspective on, term limits, both in terms of length of term and the amount of terms you can serve on a board. Definitely has its merits, but I think the pros outweigh the cons in this one as far as implementing term limits.
Yeah, it's always an interesting balance between that tenure and understanding the plan and your role versus maybe some new perspective that can come in with a new member. Talking about that, we might, and it's a great shift to sort of talk about the orientation of that new member the education that you provide to board members. And you might just both talk a little bit about that. How do you handle the education of members? Is it one big push ultimately over the course of a year or sometime during the year? Do you provide smaller snippets of education around different topics over the course of the year? What channels do you use? Ultimately, in internal education by your staff, consultant, conferences, the NAGDA conference coming up in September this year, always a great opportunity. So maybe you can both just talk about the broad level approach to educating both new members as well as tenured members. And Art, I'll let you kick this one off.
So this question is sort of unique because I haven't had a new board member really that wasn't appointed to the board on the deferred comp side anyway. On the defined benefit side, what we've done historically when we have a new member is we create a binder of all of the relevant documents that would be needed to successfully serve on the board. So things like the investment policy statement, any actuarial studies that have taken place, the investment reports from our investment consultant were included in that, the city code, the relevant piece, the sections of the city code that pertain to either the defined benefit plan or the deferred compensation plans would be included in that, relevant contact information, investment performance reports, as I mentioned. So we've created a binder of information that we give to the new member upon their official appointment to the board. And then that education continues probably for a period of 2 years where it's ongoing. We do set aside budget in our travel budget for conference seminars. NAGDA is a great resource for us. We do provide for the first time last year, we provided to our defined benefit and deferred comp plans joint fiduciary training where we talk about the market, we talk about legislative issues, and then the importance of understanding your fiduciary role on the board, what it means to be a fiduciary to either the plan participant or the plan sponsor. So a variety of things to make sure that they have the relevant information that they need to be successful as a board member. And then I always engage with them on the site to make sure that their questions are being answered in the manner in which they can understand them. Because sometimes as a new board member, some of the topics that we tend to delve into are complex, to say the least, when especially talking about the investment piece. So making sure that we're explaining things in the manner in which it's easily understood by all board members, understanding that some of the long tenured ones understand the jargon and understand the language a little better than some of the new members. So making sure that it's easily communicated. Those are some of the tactics that I've taken in the past. And then we'll be taking moving forward with the new membership that we have coming in, or will have coming in, with the expansion of the board from 5 to 7. So I'll pause there and turn it back to Katie.
Sure. Thanks, Art. So OMRF actually does have an education policy that when a trustee is actually sworn into our board, that they have to abide by. So for each year, they are required to receive at least 10 hours of education. So normally they get cumulative from all of our board meetings throughout the year. We usually say about an hour, but it's usually more like around 5 hours cumulative for all of our board meetings once a month, that they receive investment manager information and investment advisor. They will run through the reports, so that's considered education. Also, our investment advisor will do some sort of webinar that they can attend. And then we have an annual trustee retreat. The annual trustee retreat is where they receive a lot of their education, especially on when we're trying to introduce a new asset class or diving deeper into an asset class that we're actually considering, or just trends going on within the industry, new government rules, those types of things. that's where a lot of the board members actually receive their education. And then for every term after their first 5 years, they are required to obtain additional 20 hours. And that's usually done through conferences, seminars, going to NAGDA. We also have in the state of Oklahoma a public funds conference on an annual basis. So ourselves, the state-run program, the police pension, the teachers, there's 7 of us all together. We will actually get together and do some sort of education through a conference for everything. As far as with new trustees that actually do come onto the actual board, we usually send a staff member and then as many board members as we can in one trip, but they will actually fly and get certified, usually a week's worth of school to make sure that they have a good understanding, and it has a test at the end of it, and they have to get certified, and then that can actually go on their resume to say that they, did what they were supposed to. They've taken all the hours. And again, that education policy, it is required, and we keep track of it. And our executive director has a very stern talking with those trustees if for some reason they are getting near the end of the year and haven't met their education requirements.
Right, that sounds like a great formal process. And actually of note, coming through the chat was a request, if you'd mind sharing your education policy. Possibly if you're willing to do so, we can arrange for that. That's something that maybe we can talk to NAGDA and Carly about how that could occur.
Sure. Yeah, I don't think that would be any issue.
Okay, great. Interesting. I think that both of you hold essentially what you might call a trustee retreat, sort of a one-day session where you really do some in-depth education around fiduciary responsibilities and investment education and sort of legislative and regulatory occurrences. I think pretty interesting on that particular front, and I think something that can be really valuable for boards and their education, especially in meeting your CE requirements there, Katie, for that group. I might ask, as part of that process, do your boards and committees go through the process, and then maybe particularly during that retreat, of establishing annual goals or doing some kind of a strategic planning versus it just being really educational? Okay, I'll let you catch that one first, because it sounds like
no, that's fine. I would say that if there is something that we're wanting to accomplish, which usually gets established in our normal board meetings. So if we know for a fact that later on this year, we want to introduce a new asset class, during that time or during time prior, when we're trying to compile who it is and the topics that we're actually going to be presenting at that retreat, that's when we'll actually do those deeper dives. So if it's been predetermined that we know we want to dip our toe in the pool or anything like that, then that's when they will also receive that education for everything too. But it's really, I would say, hands down, just more education. But what comes out of that trustee retreat could also become a strategic goal that we have actually accomplished, but it's just been predetermined on different board meetings.
And for me, Gordon, this, in my experience with this board, historically, we've not necessarily established strategic goals. In the traditional sense, I think the overarching goal on the deferred comp board is really to drive participation and education and awareness to the plan participants about the importance of the plan. I should note that the city does not contribute to the deferred comp plan, so it's 100% participant driven, and the board's role is really to, like as I indicated at the outset, make sure that the managers are performing and the fees are as low as possible given our plan size. So on the deferred comp side, it's really just ensuring they do sort of bless the education plan that we work together with Empower to provide, and they do oversee the record keeper performance as well as the investment consultant performance. As far as setting any strategic goals on the deferred comp, that has not necessarily been the case, simply because I think the plan sponsor does not make a contribution to participant accounts because of the defined benefit plan and the contribution set forth through that pension plan. As far as the other boards that I oversee, we do have annual specific goals. You know, we need to set the retirement rates for the forthcoming year. We need to annually make sure our investment policy statement and our investment allocations are aligned with capital market expectations. We need to make sure that our annual budgets are adopted and monitoring those on an annual basis. So those are overarching objectives that the board does. I don't know that they're specific goals as much as they are tasks and objectives that need to be done on a regular annual recurring basis. But nothing as far as strategic policy or strategic goal setting from the organization's perspective. What I can say is that if there were ever a need to do that, the board would be well aligned. Each of the boards would be well aligned to carry out those functions.
Great. Well, we are rapidly approaching the top of the hour. Still a few minutes left, and I think some time to discuss some topics, but we're definitely seeing just some comments and then sort of, I think, general questions around board engagement. I think specifically over the past few years in dealing with COVID-19, the world that in which we meet has definitely changed. Many boards and committees now strictly virtual. Some, I would say, in the hybrid world, where we are a little bit in person and some virtual, and then others have gone back to fully in person. But I think at this point we've got a mix, and that is, I think, one of the challenges. And I think maybe both of you talk a little bit about that and the level of engagement. Has that been a challenge for the engagement for your boards and committees? Have there been actually positives that have come out of that shift to a little bit of a virtual world? So Art, maybe why don't you kick us off there, and then we'll follow with Katie.
Yeah, for us at the city, I think going virtual, obviously, like most of us did at the outset of the pandemic, it's actually been a good thing for the city. It's actually driven engagement from our committee members on all three of the boards, actually. And they've gotten accustomed to meeting virtually. It has had an impact on the level of engagement, the questions, the answers that, and the discussion. I was a little leery of it at first, but our board members responded well to it. I think they enjoyed the ability, like all of us did, right, to be able to work from or attend a meeting from your kitchen table or your bedroom or wherever you may be. But that flexibility to be remote in that environment has definitely driven engagement from our perspective. We didn't really have challenges with folks turning their cameras on, which is a great thing. I don't know how many of you have that problem, but sometimes it can be a challenge, especially with internal staff. But it's actually been a positive for me. Now, I do think there is merit to having in-person meetings for that personal touch, that personal feel, being able to watch body language and how you shift in your seat and what's uncomfortable. Sometimes you can't necessarily see that on camera. There was a question in the Q&A about what do you do when we don't have folks who attend meetings regularly. For the folks that are elected to our plans, there is an attendance requirement. And if that attendance requirement is not met, we have the ability to replace them as a board member. So they are all aware of that as we onboard the member to the board. I do think the city is looking coming back, at least in some hybrid fashion, here in the very near future. So we'll see what the board does with that as we come out of the pandemic and shift more to coming back into the workplace on a regular basis.
And I'll say for the OMRF board, So we started doing the virtual meetings because the governor did put into law or for state of emergency to do that. And I will say at the beginning, we made it work, just like I think everybody did. You work with what you got. And we were still able to carry out all of their fiduciary responsibilities. We were able to get business done every single month. We were still able to do the investment committee meetings, advisory committee meeting. All of those were still done. Engagement wise, I'm not going to say that it was the best. I mean, I'm not going to lie, especially for a lot, we have the split board between the actives and the retirees. You can minimize Zoom and you can still be doing your emails, checking, what's going on and everything, and, turning your camera off and answering when people come in the door. And so the engagement, I will say that during COVID and while we had the virtual meetings, did the business still get done? 100%. It did. And we streamlined it to the point where it did work very well. But we really appreciate when those trustees have the questions. Again, like I said, they poke the bear. They ask those money managers those hard-hitting questions of, why are you not making at least over the benchmark? What are we paying you for? Those types of things. And I think in person, when we do have those money managers come and, you have that face-to-face hard conversation, just like Art mentioned, you see that body language, you see the jitters that come or anything like that, and they have to pay up and have an explanation. So again, like I said, although the business on a day-to-day basis still got done, we were still able to make sure that all of our participants were taken care of. Any amendments, things like that were all done. Engagement wise, I will say it was not my favorite. We do much better in person. I like to see people's faces and be able to see them. And, I can't really tell you, I'm on my phone right now and you guys would have never even known just because of that. So the engagement purpose of it in person is definitely the way to go for us.
Great. I think with that, we'll sort of move into sort of really just the last little bit of Q&A that exists. Art, we actually saw a question come in through the chat that asked about the acceptable attendance before a board member might be removed. So somebody asking very specifically about your policy there.
Yeah, I have to check with the city clerk's office because it's a city clerk rule, but I believe for the elected members to each of the boards, if you miss 3 or more meetings in a year, you're eligible to be replaced. So and that we don't set that policy ourselves as far as each individual board. That's set by the city clerk's office that oversees Robert's rules as well. I see the chat coming up. The policy, the city clerk policy, I can absolutely research that and send that out. We'll run that through Carly and NAGDA.
Great, and I think sort of the last question we're facing, and it's sort of come in a couple times, and it's really talking about or asking about how does someone be a fiduciary to the participants and the employer, and ultimately that's not the case. When you are a fiduciary to a plan, you are a fiduciary to the participants, and you have to follow those very strict fiduciary responsibilities that we didn't get very deep into this particular meeting. We really talked about general responsibilities and board structures. But you've got to follow those standards of fiduciary responsibilities when you are a fiduciary to the participants. Ultimately, in making employer decisions, a little bit different structures as we talk about between Katie and Art. Ultimately, Art, a single employer plan, so the city of Tucson is the plan sponsor. The city itself as the employer is going to make the decision as what those plans look like as far as contribution levels, to the defined benefit plan, structures and benefits of the defined benefit plan, what the deferred compensation plan is going to look like. Katie, in turn, as a multi-employer plan, has the ability for employers to affiliate and create a lot of flexibility. So she talked a little bit about that up front, where employers can sponsor a defined contribution plan or a defined benefit plan or both. And really the features of those plans are highly flexible under their particular structures. So ultimately, the boards aren't acting as the employer in this particular case and making those employer decisions. That's ultimately, it's up to the employer. Boards are making decisions around the plan and ultimately have to act in the best interest of the plan participants. With that, I think we're sort of right about the top of the hour, or exactly at the top of the hour. So I would love to thank everyone for attendance today, and definitely enjoy the time. Would note before we close up that NAGDA does have some nice resources on their website. So there are items such as best practices guide and a primer on new board orientation if you would like to take a look at the website. Thanks so much, and everyone enjoy the rest of the week.
Thank you.